Hello, this is Deacon Joseph Swaden,
Cyro Mechanic.
and this is Orthodox Apologetics Live as usual, where today we're going to be talking about something that is a lot less, we don't talk about it as much because it's not a typical thing that we do, but somehow we got into a discussion last week about discussing things like medieval food that came up to the fasting regimens of the church historically, because there's really nothing new in the sense of fasting. I mean, we find it in the Didache, where there was the fasting on Wednesdays and Fridays, and then of course, the 40-day fast of Great Lent and other fasts as they multiplied. But it's interesting. Fasting is one of those things that differentiates Orthodox Christians from other Christian religions. With the Roman Catholic Church used to fast, but they kind of threw that away with Vatican II. But fasting is a necessary part of being Orthodox. It's not an optional thing. It's not like we're doing a nice thing. It's literally a rule of the church. So with that in mind, there were a few things that I wanted to talk about. Father, you're not saying anything.
I'm just listening. I'm nothing to say right now.
Okay, well, as you know, I mean, perhaps the thought process is there because next week, as you know, is the Holy Week of Pentecost, and then it's fast free, and then we're in another fast. So, in any case, if anyone has any questions, or about anything apologetics related, you can throw that out in the chat box there. But yeah, basically, I was very interested a couple of days ago, Father, to read about the diet of the diet of people in medieval times. And the reason why is because, of course, whenever you're talking about Western Rite, like our lives are kind of like it's kind of stunted because of that whole 9th century where there were not too many people really using it. They kind of curiously looked to see what they were eating, and I learned a lot about the food, the eating practices of the time, and I was actually really surprised.
Okay, go ahead.
The reason I was surprised is not because of how differently they ate, but because of how similarly they ate. For example, almond milk, or these nut milks that they have now, right?
Yes, I understand that. Yes.
Yeah. Did you know that actually extends back to the medieval period?
No, not really. What do we know about it?
Well, almond milk was actually made in almost exactly the same way as your average organic almond milk is made now. They would crush the almonds. They would, mix it with water. They would, sieve it out, and there you had it. You had almond milk, and you could use that during a fast period. And this was actually something they really used, and they used it a lot. Like they actually would take eggshells. I want to see if I can find. Do you mind if I go look for this? I'll explain. But they would take empty eggshells during Lent. They would fill them with almond milk, and then fill them with a little bit of saffron, and then throw them into heated rocks. Because they didn't use stoves per se.
Wait a second. Did they like poke a hole in the egg and then extract the yolk?
Right. Yep. They kept the empty eggshells.
Okay.
So now, if you give me 1 second here, because I want to see this. Because if I can find where it was, somebody actually did a reproduction. They actually used they followed the same basic pattern to make the eggs. And so let me see here. But basically, what they would do is they would use it as a kind of a boiled egg substitute. Because after they cooked this almond milk in the eggshell for a few hours, you could actually peel it off, and you had this goopy substitute egg. But the only reason that struck me as interesting was because of the fact that this is the sort of stuff we do now, and we wonder is that hypocritical or not, so on and so forth, which led me to an even weirder.
Well, they're not eating the eggshell, right? I mean,
no, well, obviously, no. Who eats eggshells? I mean, in any case, what was particularly interesting about the is that they used fish. They used meatier fish as eggs as meat substitutes, and so they would dress them up like steaks and everything like that. Now, this blew my mind because, of course, I mean, when you think of steak sauces, usually you think of A1 or you think of Worcestershire sauce. And the reason that that's interesting, and this is going to blow your mind, Father, because Worcestershire sauce is commonly used on steaks, and so you can put it on a fish steak to make it feel more like a steak because it has more of that steaky flavor. But guess what Worcestershire sauce really is?
What is it?
It is a descendant of a Roman dish, which was mentioned in the previous show, a fermented fish sauce called garum. And if you look, and that goes back to the Roman times, and that was what the Byzantines prized on this garum recipe. Worcestershire sauce.
That's what Bishop Lupran hated. He didn't like it.
Yeah, but believe it or not, if you look at any package of Worcestershire sauce, except for a kosher one, which they have limitations on fish, but a regular Lee and Perrins or even a Walmart brand, anchovies are in the ingredients because one of the ingredients of Worcestershire sauce is fermented anchovy.
Now, I'm under the impression, from a little bit of reading, that in the medieval period, and I guess the same as today for people in fasting periods, people boiled a lot of things.
Yeah.
Because simply it's the simplest way to cook things. I mean, boil vegetables, and maybe boil some fish or something like that.
There's a couple of different reasons for that, but the first one is that unlike the present where we have a lot of different pots and pans were really valued back then. It's like those, like if you ever talk about grandma's cast iron pot, like that sort of, there was, even more so because they were less prevalent there. You didn't have, a wide variety of cooking utensils. So if you had a pot, you were happy doing that. Sean Ridlin asks, can you cover the differences between the fasting in the Russian, Greek, and Western Lenten fasting, the fish, no fish thing, etc.? Oh, we can, and there's going to be some surprises if we do that. So we will do that. But,
so boiling was a common way people used to cook things because it's just very simple.
Standard staple of medieval cookery was the porridge or stew. So effectively, yeah.
And what was porridge made of? Oats, water. That's basically it, right?
No, porridges could get very, very complex.
Well, fasting porridge. What would a fasting porridge be?
They can still get complex because you have your base, which is something.
I mean, oatmeal is like a porridge, kind of, right?
Yeah, right. But now oats would be like a base. So like you have like a wheat meal or an oatmeal or something. That's just the base, and then you can throw in vegetables, and you can throw in all the other stuff and spice it up. You could make it sweet. You could make it, savory, depending on whether you want to make it a dessert or dinner. I mean, there's a couple of 15th and 16th century books that have they've made it down the ages, and it's like they just describe a variety of porridges. So
we have some Anglo-Saxon cooking books too. I think.
So. And that was and porridge was definitely a staple, but you could do a whole lot of things with porridge. So they weren't limiting themselves too badly. But yeah, you're right. The fasting regimen changed the way people ate. At the time, especially with the harmony between church and state, when a great fast came about, like Great Lent, meat shops just closed.
And I should also point out that for a very long time, when they talked about fasting, what they meant was not just abstaining from meat and dairy and animal products, but they meant actually not eating until like what we would consider 3 p.m. or even after Vespers.
Correct.
Now that caused some issues among royal courts, and what some of them tried to do as early as the late 8th century, like in France. They were saying, well, let's celebrate the services, the mass and the Vespers, like around 9 o'clock in the morning, kind of like to get technically around the requirement. Not so they would everything. It's almost like I think in the Russian church. I don't know if this is true everywhere. I'm not sure if it's true in the Greek church, but I know that a lot of Russians the celebration of pre-sanctified liturgy is oftentimes done like at 9 o'clock in the morning or 10 o'clock. I don't know if you've ever seen that before, Father Joseph. And so that because pre-sanctified liturgy is in the Eastern churches, in the Eastern Rite is essentially kind of Vespers, a communion service attached with Vespers at the end, So whereas the original idea was that everybody should really be fasting into the late afternoon or the early evening, and only then you would eat a fasting food. However. But let's get into a little bit the different fasting or abstinence rules, Father Joseph.
Well, okay. One thing we have to remember, because we do want to answer that
yes.
Question. one thing we have to remember is that the ideal of the church was always first zoophagy.
Yes.
So that's how the earliest Christians started in the
Bread and water.
Yeah.
Or uncooked vegetables and water.
Correct. And
so I guess an uncooked carrot and water or something, I guess.
Right. And after the
and that only after Vespers, really after and later it was kind of like after the ninth hour was.
And all of these variations that you see, whether the Russian, the Greek, and the Western style, all of them were accommodations made
concession
because the people couldn't handle it. The liturgy of St. John Chrysostom is a shortening of the liturgy of St. Basil because people were falling asleep during the service.
And St. Euphemius, so the Holy Mountain of the 10th century, says that one of the reasons in the country of Greece, the area we call Greece, by the 9th century, they had kind of abandoned the liturgy of St. James, which St. Euphemius says was the in fact original liturgy of like Greece itself, was because it was just simply so long.
Yeah.
And so everybody was like, oh, let's just go straight to St. John Chrysostom. But so fasting, so one thing just about Russian and Greek rules, as I understand, Father Joseph, is the Russians the Russians allow shrimp, or do they not allow shrimp? What's the issue with that?
Well, what it is the Russians understand shrimp as a Greek rule. So, in other words, some Russians will eat shrimp because they know it is allowed in the calendar in the Greek church. Some Russians will not because they see it as foreign. So,
and caviar is allowed on what days?
Caviar is
fasting periods.
It's allowed in like 3 or 4 days of the year. But this is an odd thing. I noticed in the last Lent, and I don't know if this is just a Moscow thing that they just introduced now, but during certain parts of Lent they allow fish. That's surprising.
Well, Annunciation you can eat fish.
Yeah. So there are days you can't eat fish on the Russian calendar. The shellfish thing would definitely be more. That would have been more of a Greek concession simply because they live so close to the water, whereas most Russians don't. Well, I mean, now they do because most of the city is closer to the edge. But I mean, most of the big cities are closer to the edge, and the center of Russia is largely uninhabited. But the point is that in that sense, the Russians would be more of an example to how people in countries like Germany or France ate, because those would have been a much more similar diet. The Highlands would have been far less seafood. So small fish.
And I believe St. Isidore of Seville makes a distinction between large fish, which can and small fish that you should eat. What is it? You can eat small fish during fasting periods, but you can't eat the larger fish.
I think that's because of the fact that larger fish were generally considered meatier. Like,
yes.
I mean, if you eat a tuna steak, it's pretty meat. You could dress it up, and that's what a lot of people did in the medieval period, especially among the upper classes, is that they would dress up something like a tuna steak or a trout steak in a.
Now, in England during the Anglo-Saxon period, the pre-conquest period, they kind of had two rules. That is, there were in fact capitular books that said if you want to keep a more perfect fast, you don't eat fish. They actually did have that. But what happened is that if you lived near the coast, people did eat fish.
Yeah.
It kind of came to the point where if you're living further inland, it was just, did you really want to go through all the, if you're not eating it after like 3 o'clock or the 9th hour or Vespers to begin with, how much trouble did you want to go through with cooking to begin with? Anyway, continue, Father Joseph. So the basic rule among Russians and Greeks is obviously no meat, no dairy. Fish is allowed only in certain periods of fasting times, right?
Right.
So, for example, like in Apostles' Fast, is it allowed? I think it's, what is it? Is it not allowed or allowed on the? I mean, I'm not Eastern Rite. I don't really know. What is the rule of Apostles' Fast?
I'm pretty sure fish is allowed on Apostles' Fast.
On basically what? So Monday, Saturday, and Sunday, right?
Let me take a look real quick, just to double check, because I've been using.
I think the same thing may be in the Nativity Fast.
Yeah. Here, it's it says here for many Orthodox fish, wine, and all allowed on all days except Wednesdays and Fridays. So, like, and then it says some others, such as the Antiochians, allow fish only on certain weekends. Um, so that's it's there are variations where fish is allowed in Eastern rites. I think in the Western rite they never made so many distinctions, only because a lot of the rules, especially regarding shellfish, if I remember correctly, were concessions. I think, if I remember correctly, to the imperial classes.
Now there's now Sean Ridland says a feast day on a fast day is a fish day generally.
Yeah,
I think this isn't that also true that if you can eat oil on the, you can have olive oil, you can also eat fish, correct?
that's why they're fish, wine, and oil days. Yeah.
Yes, I mean those are the Eastern the rule. I mean I'm Western Rite Orthodox, so I don't really interact a lot with
Part
that.
of the reason the biggest difference between Western and Eastern rite fasting is that basically the Western rite fast rules kind of the concession to fish became common, even though it wasn't considered. I guess it wasn't considered universal, but then because of the relative stagnation of the Western rite for like 900 years, the rule hadn't been modified for things like you could have caviar on this day, because there were no Western rite Orthodox to really point that out, and by then the West had already had gone into the Hildebrandian route, and by then they were talking about whether otters were fish.
Yeah, ridiculous stuff like that.
Yeah, like, is a beaver a fish? And it's just now obviously we know that they're not, and I think deep down they did too. But the point is,
well, in the Papist Church, technically, their rules until like 1912 were that fasting meant you could not eat meat or dairy products. You could have fish, but that was the furthest they would go. They basically abolished those rules beginning in 1912 or 13, I believe.
Yeah. And
everything after that was basically one long downhill event. For example, like in the 17th century in Ireland, there was this mass attempt to get the Irish to actually stop fasting. It was by the Jesuits. They actually tried to do that. Now that sounds sort of strange, but they felt, oh well, the Irish are persecuted by the Protestants. We're trying to help them out. And the Irish are like, we know this makes us different. Why do we want to actually eat just like the Protestants? So I mean, Papism kind of did its own thing where they destroyed their own practices that are actually derived from before the schism from within. And that's the route of Papism. It's constant innovation and destruction.
Yeah, I mean, by the time you get to the 18th century in the Papal Church, you're finding like I'm looking.
They were doing dispensations, like we're dispensing this. So they'd have a role. But then they dispense certain countries from certain things.
Yeah, and then I'm reading this one from the Catholic Encyclopedia. This is mind blowing. It says that in 1741, Benedict the 14th granted permission to eat meat on fasting days, though he distinctly prohibited the use of fish and flesh at the same meal on all fasting days of the year, as well as on Sundays during that. So I guess that means if you're going to eat meat on a fasting day, you just have to go all out with it.
Yeah,
that's bizarre.
It's terrible.
But so what it comes down to is ultimately, as much as people like to say, well, maybe the Western Rite fast is easier. Yeah, but the Western Rite fast, it makes the whole abstinence until 3 o'clock mandatory, which is only, I think, done amongst certain groups of Russians. But unless if you want to do that, that's fine. You can have your tiny snack in the morning and have bread and water until Vespers. I mean,
there would be no tiny snack in the morning.
Well, I thought the collation was allowed.
No, collation is supposed to happen after Compline.
Really?
There is no. There is no. You're not technically. I mean, well, if the reason is that you're supposed to take communion at a service in the afternoon, in the evening. So you can't eat something. You can't get up in the morning and eat something if you're going to take communion at the very end of the day.
No, I would. Well, yeah, but I'm talking about on a regular Wednesday or Friday where the communion.
Oh no. The idea. Well, the presupposition of the canons.
You commute.
And however, Abba Alfred of Ensham, who died in 1010, said even if you don't take communion, you still have to fast everything, even unto the end of Vespers, because what was happening, Abba Alfred said people are taking is that in fact Abba Alfred's point back in the year 1000 AD was that if you're going to take the Antidoron or the Eulogia bread, you still have to receive that fasting. Now, no one does that anymore a lot of times, but their rule was that even taking the Eulogia bread. Even if you don't take communion or the Antidoron bread, you still have to receive that fasting. All right, so that is in fact the strict rule about it.
Yeah, so the idea that it's somewhat easier because at 5 o'clock in the afternoon you can have a tuna sandwich with fake mayo is not exactly a comfort. I mean,
I think vegetable stew actually isn't that bad to have every day,
vegetable stew is great. As long
especially if it has like tomato sauce maybe based or something. Like just put some tomatoes in it or whatever. I don't think it's that bad.
no tomato, just tomato-based sauce is great. And you can make it with some farinata. Now, this is an interesting thing that I learned is that farinata, which is a type of prep type bread that originated in I think it was the 10th or 11th century. Supposedly, they say it's the 11th century. But basically, it's chickpea flour that was cooked onto a plate. And so, in like a shield, well, originally the legend is it was a big shield, but it was a metal plate. And so the point is, then they just cut it up into irregular pieces, and you eat it with various things.
What is this called?
Farinata.
Okay.
So I'm gonna see if I can use my handy. Let's see if I can use my handy this thing to see if I can show what's on it. Give me a second.
Isn't it going to? However, a question about this isn't it eventually going to become really problematic if they get to the point where artificial meat substitutes that are not meat, that are totally based upon vegan products, become indistinguishable from meat and even cheaper than meat, and they're just as healthy, or they're basically not that bad. What happens if all of our meat, all of our food, eventually is artificialized? If you know what I mean, or what happens then?
I don't know
Because what happens at that point? I see it right there. That's what you're talking about.
Yeah. What the problem is this, and this is what shocked me about studying the whole the whole different kinds of foods that people ate back then, is that the nature of substitution has been around for so long. Basically, hold on one second, because it seems that
You're having some technical difficulties there, Father Joseph. Okay, are you there? All right. See, Father Joseph may have dropped out of the call. I think he muted himself. Okay, just waiting. But in the meantime, no, the old. Okay, go ahead.
sorry about that. No,
All right.
what I was going to, what was I talking about before I went to this? Oh yeah,
Well, what I was making the point was that if, let's say, you live in a country where, let's say, like India, where there's a lot of vegan stuff.
yeah.
How do you, if you're already eating vegan stuff on a non-fasting day anyway, what do you really do on a fasting day, except just delay the time of your eating, and maybe the amount, and maybe eat just bread and water. I don't know what to say.
Well, I mean, the thing is, there are. I think it was Saint John the Russian who had the different levels of fasting, but in that, I've never found that to be too compelling an argument. Only because if a person lives in an area like that, they can still eat less, and they can still eat according to the fast period.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is that ultimately the difficulty of the fast is not the diet. There are vegans who are not Christian, they are fully atheists, they don't eat that much. But you know what? They're not fasting because fasting is under obedience to God. And what I have seen and I have experienced is that when you are under a fast, even if you are allowed, shellfish or fish, so on and so forth, it's still difficult. And it's difficult because the evil one makes it difficult. It's not difficult because of the diet.
Okay, fair enough.
But as for the nature of things becoming substituted, what blew my mind is the history of substitution of during fasts in the church is pretty much as ancient as fasting itself. I mean, even falafel, was technically a meat substitute. It was technically supposed to substitute for ground beef. So it's in that sense. I think that there's going to, what they're looking to do now with technology is this so-called clean meat. I don't know if you've heard of this, Father.
Well, I saw an advertisement on YouTube for this like a fake vegan hamburger they're having at Burger King, That's supposed to. I don't know if you've seen that. It's
Oh,
supposed
wait,
to.
it's the one that was supposed to be the Impossible Burger. And
The Impossible Burger, yes, that's what they call it, and they're testing it out in different locations. I don't know if I don't know much
yeah, well,
more about
actually, no. Well, it never. Here's what the big scandal is, that it wasn't available in a couple of Burger Kings in New York, but it appeared on DoorDash, and so people were ordering it, and nobody knew what to make of it when they got the order, so they just made regular Whoppers.
it. I'm confused. What transpired?
DoorDash is an online ordering service, and they had listed in New York that they had this Impossible Whopper, a Whopper made with the Impossible Burger.
So DoorDash is a restaurant, or do they go to restaurants and get food for you?
They go to restaurants and get the food.
Oh, okay.
Delivery service. But they put this Impossible Burger on the menu in some New York Burger King locations, and because the Burger King employees who did not get these Impossible Burgers did not know what they were, they simply made Whoppers out of regular meat and sent them over. So
They okay, say that one more time. They did what?
They sent over regular Whoppers.
Oh, well, I guess a disappointment. You think you're getting a vegan Whopper, and you're like, this tastes like a real Whopper, right?
The feeling you get when you're like, this tastes just like a real Whopper.
Yes.
But
okay, so are they still going through with this kind of Impossible Burger foods, or they canceled it or not?
No, it's what's happened is that they're trying desperately to keep up with orders, and they're not able to. It's becoming difficult. A lot of these plant-based substitutes. I experienced this with the Just Corporation when they did the egg substitute Just Egg. They literally got rid of all their other products just to push Just Egg, and it was a real mess. But and the truth of the matter is Just Egg a good substitute? Well, it depends. If it's at price parity with an egg, I'd say sure, but it's not. So until it is, I can't see.
Sean Ridland has a interesting question that I'm sure a lot of us are looking at. He says, "I'd like to hear about what to do when conflicts arise during Lent. Like, for instance, when you go to the in-laws, they made meat because they aren't Orthodox." Well, first of all, do they know that you as an Orthodox are fasting and that you have certain dietary rules, and are they just making meat anyway? I mean, if they are they kind of disrespecting? If like a husband's like, look, if a husband and a wife are Orthodox but the wife's parents are still Baptist, and you say, look, we as Orthodox, we have these dietary rules, and you tell them ahead of time, and then you go to their house and they still made meat, and you said, well, didn't I explain this? And like, well, we don't care. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what you think about that, Father Jesus, but that seems like that's kind of disrespect on the part of the.
I would say that's because I mean, having experienced oddities of this sort, so on and so forth, with in-laws and other family members, when it comes to a fasting period, it's also a good time not to go out for visits. If your in-laws really want to see your wife, etc., tell them to come over and don't bring up the food. Just make a fasting meal and let them talk about how exotic it is. In other words, if you can avoid conflict for something like that, it's better to, only because the majority of people outside of Orthodoxy simply won't care.
Well, I know there are two schools of, one school of thought you're going to hear from people is something like, well, just eat whatever they give. It doesn't really matter. They're going to quote the gospel reference about where Christ says, just eat what's given put before you. The other school of thought is that that's really not talking about this instance, because that was talking about missionaries going out and poor people not having very good foods and giving you whatever they had. It's not talking about going to your in-laws and them presenting a sumptuous banquet of turkey, and it's Wednesday in Great Lent.
Yeah, my point. If it's Wednesday in Great Lent, maybe just avoid the turkey altogether.
Yeah, and the point is that if you're there, if you're asking me what I would do, I would simply say, I'm sorry, I can't eat this. And if they get upset like you're disrespecting us, my reply would simply, and I know this people may disagree with me, is my reply is that you've been disrespecting me by, I'm telling you what I'm doing. And
well, it's a little more complex when you're dealing with the in-laws, because then you're offending your wife's parents. And so effectively, in this particular case, if your wife is Orthodox, this is something that can be covered before any such visit occurs. And this is why I generally personally follow a rule of trying to avoid going.
I think he's saying, what if we forgot about all that? We just show up and they have this food and they expect us to eat it, and we're put in a bad situation. What do we do then?
That's you see now. I'm a little more pragmatic on that in the sense that if it's you've traveled all this way, you travel 100 miles, so on and so forth. Technically, a traveling canon doesn't apply once you. I mean, the question of whether you're still traveling if you stopped moving. You forgot everything. Your wife forgot everything, and there's the food there.
I'm still saying I wouldn't eat it. That's all I'm saying.
Well, I'm saying that I'm saying if you did eat it, confess it, but I don't think it would be that big of a deal because of it. But
all right. Well, you can take care of it in confession, but I'm saying if it was me, now
yeah.
Sean says the problem is that because we have so many fast days and fasting periods, that his in-laws are not doing it to be mean or anything. They don't know about their schedule and they forget about it.
Well, they're not trying to be mean, and you guys have to see them a lot, and you do see them during fast periods. I have a suggestion which is very simple. Hello?
Yeah, we're waiting for your suggestion.
Bring a dish, one that you can eat.
Also, tell them ahead of time.
You know? Yeah, well, you tell them ahead of time, but also when something like that comes up, cook a dish for them. You know, then that way, you can say, "Hey, it's a fast. I brought over this fancy blank." And the point is now not only are you covered on the fast, but also you look like a really good son-in-law because you brought over a dish.
Oh, okay. All right, that's a good answer.
I don't know. I mean, I hope that works for you, Sean. I mean, that sort of thing has worked for me. Also, just not going out that much during. I mean, it helps that my father-in-law, doesn't really, eat meat at all. So the point is, he's actually kind of happy when he comes over our house. So, but outside of that, I would say that's that's bringing a dish. Planning ahead. The key is, no matter what it is, planning ahead will solve all your problems.
Now, it should be noted that there was, since ancient times, one tradition that you found universally among the church, East and West, was that on the days of the Holy Triduum, strict Zorophagy was practiced even after the Mass, the liturgy and Vespers of the day.
For those who aren't familiar with what the term Triduum is, it's a Western term for the days of Holy Friday.
Oh, so Holy Thursday, Holy Friday, Holy Saturday. And Holy Saturday is technically the only Saturday, according to the canons, in a year that you actually are supposed to do a strict fast. And by that, we just don't mean, eat, after you go to liturgy in the morning and then Vespers and then like 2 o'clock you come in, you eat, vegetable soup or whatever. What the canons actually mean by saying a fast on full fasting on Holy Saturday, especially, is Zorophagy. So bread and water or uncooked foods, uncooked vegetables and water and such. And I believe anyway, but okay. So Atomic League says also give an excuse to talk about fasting to the in-laws. Oh, well, that's another thing too.
Yeah, Sean said he confesses the priest just extends the fast by a day. I mean, that's his choice. Those are good suggestions. One time I had a meet us at an Indian place, and father-in-law brought a sack of burgers. Okay, that seems a little intentional. If you're going to an Indian restaurant and your father-in-law brings a sack of burgers, he's making a statement. Because no one goes to a restaurant and brings their own food. It just
because even if they're Protestants, don't they remember? And they claim that you're not supposed to do fasting anymore. I get a lot of Protestants will claim you're not supposed to make distinctions in food and things. Don't they remember what the Apostle Paul says in Romans, where he says, if the weaker brother doesn't wish to eat this type of food, don't eat that type of food in front of him.
Yeah, but then why would you do that at an Indian place? Nobody wants to eat a burger there. I mean,
why go to an Indian place and your father-in-law comes and he's got like a big bag of 10 Big Macs or 10 Whoppers?
I mean, that's not just offending the people you're with. That's not just offending you. That's offending the owner of the restaurant.
The restaurant
working there.
Yeah, it's like going into Burger King and saying, "I'm going to eat my lunch here," and I brought in a bunch of yeah. So don't mind me.
I brought my own soda too.
Exactly. I just, I guess I'll buy a cup of coffee.
You guys make coffee? Oh boy. Let me see.
Yeah, that did not for a long time. Atomic Lead. Atomic Lead says, I believe the posters in West for freedom upheld the black fast of 1 meal of bread with salt and herbs and water only after sundown. That's true for a very long time. However, I think that I'm not. I think by now you could correct me, but I think maybe by the late 19th century they had kind of gone away from that.
Yeah, no.
I think the problem is that I think technically on the books, Atomic Lead, you're right. If you look technically on the books about what should have been done, like even like in 1900 in the Latin Roman Catholic Church, they would have said that. But there were so many dispensations, especially in the United States, that I mean they were letting the Irish eat beef and hash on St. Patrick's Day for some. I don't know why.
Believe it or not,
St. Patrick died on land, but he never would have said that.
Well, the reason they actually the St. Patrick's Day thing is really more of just to join in the spirit of the age. But most of
especially in the United States, there was this big movement among American Roman Catholic clergy called Americanism, which was that you didn't want to distinguish yourself in any way that you didn't have to from your neighbors, which is basically a form of modernism. This gets into the question of the modernist Father Joseph, who wanted to come into the Orthodox, have tried to come into Orthodoxy and essentially abolish the fasting rules almost entirely. And remember, there was what was the 1923 Congress the Ecumenical Patriarchate had? Am I correct in saying 1923?
Yeah, 1923.
Which was the one that they had a number of quote unquote reforms. One was the new calendar. Okay, that was one. Two was clergy can get married after ordination. Or, they can have a second marriage even after the wife dies, as a rule. Three, the fasting rules have to be adjusted or diminished. I'm not exactly sure how they envisioned that, doing that. Four was shortening of the services. And these are all things that the Ecumenical Patriarchate technically couldn't get through, but they did. The big thing they did get through was, of course, the new calendar. All right, because that was part of the ecumenical agenda back in 1920. Although the Living Church, the schismatic, heretical, renovationist Living Church, and maybe the Gregorians, who were kind of related to them, they did push through all these ecumenical patriarchate agendas, because technically the Living Church was, according to St. John Maximovich, in communion with the ecumenical patriarchate until like 1941, or something like that. But there's the idea that the modernist idea seems to be that modern people have it more difficult than medieval people. This is essentially what they're saying. Therefore, because modern people have a more difficult situation about food than medieval people, you should be allowed to eat whatever you want as long as you keep the spirit of prayer during the season or something like that. First off, correct me if I'm wrong, Father Joseph, but I think it's a little bit exaggerated to say that a medieval person, like in 1000 AD, had it better with food choices and quality than someone in like 2018.
Oh no!
I mean, you pretty much you had to if you didn't keep your garden in good shape, the only way to get food was either charity or trying to scrounge up some money or something to go hunt something. I mean, I don't know where this modernist argument is that the modern man cannot fast like ancient peoples. And
but it's always about Christians, because if you look at the hard Christians and you look at all these weird alternative movements, they all have incredibly complex fasting rules. And the point is, some of them are strict to the point where it's not safe. And so, but because people are allowed to believe in these ridiculous ideologies, as long as they aren't, they don't have the name Jesus attached to them, then it's perfectly okay to.
Look at like Orthodox Jews. Have all these like kosher this, kosher that, and all the rest. All right, and they have to be very strict about what they do. Yet somehow that's considered acceptable. But Orthodox Christians, having strict fasting rules is considered weird.
Or we could say continue on, and you say like, well, how come Orthodox have to fast 40 days of Lent, and then you wish someone a happy Ramadan? Well, think that one through.
Atomic Lead says Pius XII actually allowed American bishops to dispense their diocese from fasting the Friday after Thanksgiving, if my info is correct. If anything, we should be stricter with ourselves in this era. So.
Yeah, I believe it. Unfortunately, again, it's all those dispensations that Father Enoch mentioned earlier.
Because some of those started in the 14th century with the butter towers. Remember those?
Well, the butter towers that was for the nobles, but the big dispensation.
Oh, the villages applied to the villages. If the villages contributed to the butter tower, they got a dispensation too.
Yeah. But the point is, it was usually because of the
But it was a perpetual dispensation as long as the bell rung and they said some kind of prayer for the Pope or something like that.
Oh,
So,
wow, I didn't know that. I didn't realize that the butter towers were that bad. I mean, Luther condemns them very strongly, and that led to the Reformation.
well, remember, technically, it was about the papacy selling kind of indulgence or the equivalent of indulgence for the butter towers. It was a way of raising money.
Yeah,
So,
but the point is, it was a twisted way of raising money that took advantage of other people.
but the papacy always did stuff like this. Like, for example, if you look at like how the English Reformation started, it started obviously why? Because Henry wanted to divorce his wife, wanted to declare his marriage annulled so he could get another wife. Okay, because he felt, oh, she can't have, because he felt it's the woman who determines whether the son or boy or girl.
Right.
But technically, if the Pope even that time had been following the technical on the books canon law, even of the Gratian canon, the Gratian decretals, the marriage of Henry to Catherine never would have been allowed. You know why? Because Catherine was his sister-in-law, his brother's wife. All right, and Orthodox, if the West had been Orthodox at the time, the marriage never would have been allowed.
Yeah.
All right, because it doesn't matter that you're like she's not a blood relative. That was your brother's wife. You can't just
That's skeevy. I didn't even know that.
The Pope allowed the Pope. So they allowed his brother's wife.
He had a whole bunch of wives.
Well, the problem is that that's also kind of pretty weird. But it was considered pretty. It was pretty weird to begin with. You get a dispensation from the Pope. The Pope allows the situation so that you can marry your sister-in-law after your brother dies.
That's just.
It was also because the Holy Roman Emperor was, I think, the uncle of Catherine. So anyway.
Well, one of the things that making Atomic Libra making fasting easier for the nobility shouldn't have needed a Luther to condemn it as obviously unethical. I think the bigger problem, and one that Luther did note, is that, for example, like exemptions for the older infirm could have been granted by a priest, but they had arrogated that directly to the Pope. So a regular priest could have actually, made it easier for some of these people. But they basically said, no, you'd have to go through the Pope, and therefore limiting who could be exempted from the fast to begin with.
And of course, then Luther eventually just throws the baby out the bathwater with a lot of stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's like a total other reaction, which makes things bad also. So.
Well, in any case, so
when you go to the Father Joseph, so when you go to the supermarket with your family for. Is it more expensive for you to buy fasting foods or vegan foods in this for you to buy regular foods? What's the situation with that?
Well, I suggest to people if they want to do you want to go the meat substitute route, etc. I suggest looking for they're usually I don't know what they call them, whether they're secondhand food store. They're usually just referred to as discount stores where foods that don't sell, like say at Wegmans or something, they get resold at a store closer to their expiration date. That egg substitute, the Just Egg I was talking about that I mentioned was, it basically costs around $10 a bottle, and it makes about 8 eggs worth.
And what is it made from again?
It's made from mung beans.
Oh, okay.
And so, but it's just basically powderized mung beans that are then reliquefied. And it actually works fairly well. But when I went to a discount store, I saw them. They didn't sell because who's going to pay $10 for 8 fake eggs? But they were selling for 79 cents. So this Lent, this Great Lent, it was like literally a week before Great Lent, so it was like 79 cents a bottle. So I bought like 30 of them, and I put them in the freezer. Because I figured, once you have because once you go to these discount stores, if you see something like that, one of these weird vegan deals, if they have the vegan sausage and stuff like that, just grab them all. Like, especially if they're not made with soy. So, the point is, grab them all, throw them in the freezer. They'll last, because they're vegetables. They'll last a year. They don't tell you that, but yeah. You throw that
so the Just Egg substitute can last if it's frozen a year or more?
Well, it can last for months. I mean, I don't know. I ate them all, but it took me
well, how does it taste? I mean, when I do fasting, I'm just buying vegetables, canned vegetables or things like that, or that have little or no salt in it.
Well, you've had eggs during a non-fasting period,
Yes, I know what eggs taste like.
Right. Well, try to imagine like eggs that scramble and then just taste kind of like egg whites with a little less flavor.
Oh, okay. So kind of flavorless eggs.
Yeah, pretty much. But you can put all sorts of things in them, like vegetables, and then you have like a fake omelet. And, that's basically how I went through Lent this year. You couldn't, ironically, because you shouldn't use oil, but these things are actually stickier than actual eggs. What I ended up doing was throwing them in a microwave in a plate, and then just running the microwave for like 6-7 minutes, and then they would just kind of peel off the plastic plate. But they kind of felt plasticky too. Now that I think about it, but the point is, they tasted okay. And so, that I was going to write a thing about that, but in any case, I don't know if I still wouldn't pay $10 a bottle, but 79 cents, definitely worth it on a fast day because it does have the protein levels and it doesn't have cholesterol or what's the carbs.
Now, what do you think about eating peanut butter and jelly sandwiches during fasting?
A lot of people love them. I mean,
that's what I do sometimes. So
that's a big thing, especially with the kids. When it's a fast period, there's no meat to cook up there. You have peanut butter and jelly there.
Well, I know some people would, if they're really really strict, are going to say, well, they say no olive oil, but it also means any oil that comes from a plant. And I know how, and some people will say, is there oil actually in the peanut oil?
If it's separate peanut oil, sure, but if it's the peanut oil that comes naturally from the peanut, I wouldn't have.
No, I understand. I'm just giving an objection. I could imagine some people would say.
The point is, yeah, I mean the peanut butter. I think if a person's like, well, there's oil in that. Yeah, there's oil in a peanut. You can't separate that. Same thing with olives. You can't eat an olive without there being some oil in it. The whole point of the oil restriction to begin with is based around butter. It's based around flavor, using oil to flavor an item.
Now, interestingly, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, if you read some of the original longer or shorter rules of St. Basil,
okay,
he actually allowed there to be, and I'll check this, I think he actually allowed, there was some allowment of pig fat even on fasting days.
Lard.
Soup. Lard, yes. Let me look at that. Because they didn't, now that changed over time in the Byzantine Typicon to the point where like, we don't allow it anymore, but I think by the year 1000, they were like, we don't allow this anymore, But I know in the Regularis Concordia, which is from the 10th century in England, they made a point that lard should stop being consumed as early as Septuagesima Sunday. So they kind of stopped using lard in preparation for everything coming up and such, So.
Now I wonder how they would have felt about peanut oil at the time, though, because
you got to think in England. They didn't really. I mean, I think they could have grown olives like in that time, and because they were having a warm period in some areas. You could have probably grown some olives like in very very southern tip of England because they did have some vineyards down there.
It just would have used butter.
But this is actually a consistent problem. Talking about olive oil, you needed olive oil. Bishops needed olive oil because they had to mix it with myrrh and other unguents to make chrism on Holy Thursday. But it was if you get in Northern Europe, especially England, Scotland, and especially Ireland, you could not really grow olives in Ireland.
Yeah, they had.
You'd have to. Theoretically, you might be able to grow them if you were taking really good care of the tree. There were all kinds of tricks, but it was really, really difficult. And so during around the year 790, in France, they had to ship something like 3,000 gallons of chrism to Ireland because the Irish almost had hardly any chrism left. Everybody was a big, big shortage. It's actually recorded in some of the historical accounts of the days and such. Because France, you could get olive oil in Spain or obviously in France, because France, you have the southern Mediterranean coast, and, you can just ship olive oil up and such,
Oh, boy, here comes a fun question. What are the customs for alcohol? I've heard that drinks under a certain proof were permitted, which would allow beer but not wine. Thank you, Atomic Lead. Yeah, that's a complex question. One thing we do know is that in the medieval period, believe it or not, consumption of alcohol, based on what we see recorded, actually did go up during fasting periods. And this is most likely because of the difficulty of the fast. But in terms of what you were drinking, it depended, because a drink like mead, quite frankly, can hit almost wine-like levels of alcohol. So I don't think that would have been allowed. But a part of it is also the production of how something is made. When you make fresh wine or you make fresh beer for quick consumption, it's going to have lower alcohol content than something that's been steeped, because of the fact that it needs more time for the fermentation to take place, which makes for a stronger alcoholic beverage.
Well, let me ask you a question here, Father. I hate to interrupt you, though.
Yeah, sure.
But on the Russian calendar, the Greek calendar, they're going to say oil and wine allowed on this day, oil and wine not allowed on this day. Okay, so when you lived in Russia, on the Great Fast, did Russians who were observant that would they even on a Sunday or Saturday, even on a weekday, let's say, would they abstain from any kind of alcoholic drink, or what? How was that? Do they have like a interpretation where it only means wine, but they could drink vodka, or what was the idea?
Vodka. First off, as we know, vodka is stronger than wine. So the question would be
grappa or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, well, the question would be on lesser beverages, and the lesser beverages would be things like kvass or things like beer, and even some beers would be suspect. But the point is, lighter items would be considered not really wine, but anything that was fairly stronger wine would be prohibited. Because that's literally what you're trying to avoid. Vodka was not allowed. I'm sure that many people were, drinking it, but I didn't see that was very common.
So, like, if, for example, they would have said on a Monday in Great Lent, you could drink a beer that was like 7% alcohol or 5% alcohol.
They wouldn't say that you would. It would just be a natural assumption that it was not considered hard liquor. Okay. So, in other words, it would not be like permitted per se. I think that if you asked if it was permitted, people would give you kind of a side eye, like, why do you care so much about something like that? Because you have to realize, kvass technically, has 2 to 3% alcohol. So does, some kvasses are lower, the corporate produced ones. But I'm talking about the homebrew type of kvass. But in that case, that's the same as a light beer. It's just that it has more sugar in it and it tastes like tea. But effectively, so does a twisted tea, and that would technically, I guess, be considered okay. But if it came to a question of if you were asking about the alcoholic content of beer, it would be prohibited. Because if you're that concerned, then it's not a regular beverage to you. In other words, if you're looking forward to it as some sort of, kind of a big drinking thing, you shouldn't be having it for Lent.
Okay.
So if, like, say for example, if it wasn't like a person would be like, let's say you had your regular Russian and they would have vodka, and then it's a fast, they wouldn't have vodka. They wouldn't suddenly go out and buy 10 beers too, because then that would be clearly what they were doing was trying to match up with that feeling. That wouldn't be allowed.
No, I understand. I mean, I don't really consume alcohol except to cleanse out the chalice and things, because whatever. So
keep in mind that in Russia, as a culture, people would drink for lunch, like on a work day.
And of course, we should note that technically, when it says wine and oil, not allowed, even on a certain day, I mean, technically, even although the wine becomes the blood of the Lord, the priest is going to have to use unconsecrated wine to clean the chalice out, but that's not considered, like breaking.
Right, you just
the rules. It's just like how our Lord says in the gospel that the priests do in the temple serve on the Sabbath, and they're breaking the Sabbath, but they're not really sinning because they're supposed to do that.
Yeah, one thing, it's not like you're supposed to use it as a cleansing. Aren't you supposed to alternate between wine and water after the service?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, because you can't just be like, okay, well, let me fill up the chalice.
Exactly. I mean, pour the rest of the half a bottle. Yeah, I understand. Okay.
That's hygienic, not like an extra chance to get.
Well, I don't know. I've been to large liturgies where they have this humongous chalice.
Are you talking about
Greece? When I've been in Greece, when I've been in Avalona, and the chalice is literally. Well, maybe I'm kidding. The chalice is like. I mean, it takes. I mean, you can lift it up as one person if you're at the holy table and you're just going to have like a bishop. I see they could kind of barely lift it up and drink from it. From the Lord's blood. But that chalice was like so humongous that they had to bring in other chalices, to pour, to pour from the blood from the main chalice into the smaller chalices and put the body in there to get the communion. But my point is that when the deacons took the chalice to the proscomedia room, prosthesis chapel, which they actually had a separate chapel, I can imagine the deacons who had to consume all the rest of the blood. I mean, most of it was put into the other chalices, but there was still a lot of it in there. And then they had to put a lot of regular unconsecrated wine in there to cleanse it out. That would have been a big job. And then all the extra chalice. I mean, I'm assuming they didn't have one. I don't remember if they had one deacon having to cleanse out like 15 chalices or something like that.
They had a lot of clergy though. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think they had a few deacons that could have done it all together. But anyway,
It would be a pain. That was a very big chalice. Like, I'm pretty sure you could baptize a baby in it.
no, it was humongous. It was gigantic, you know. So
But
now, interestingly, there are chalices we've discovered excavated from Syria from like the 5th century that are just humongous, Father Joseph. They could contain 120 gallons of wine.
yeah,
I mean, this is because theoretically I mean, you're talking about things that almost look like, you ever seen those gigantic, you know the gigantic, they look like chalices and you do baptisms in them, right?
yeah.
Right? Baby baptisms for infants, or you consecrate some, anyway, they had chalices that were that humongous, like in the ancient church.
Well, they had them in the West too.
Oh, no, they did. In fact, in Rome and other large cities, they did. But what happened, and that's because, like in Antioch, 10,000 people would be taking communion.
Yeah.
All right. Now, what happened in Rome, for example, is they began to have the humongous chalice, but then they began to introduce other smaller chalices, like they did. And they did that Byzantium eventually too, because like it got to the point where if you're going to have this like 100-gallon chalice, you can't, it's going to be, that was just considered too much of a danger, to be honest.
And it's not even. It wasn't just a danger of drinking too much. It was a danger of sacrilege.
No, that's my point. It's a danger of you're gonna have to have, because they have these 2 handles on the chalice. All right. So the 2 deacons, 1 or 2 deacons would have to carry around, just like you have gospel books that you find in the Order Romanus, but in the Byzantine Typicon, ritual too, where some of these gospel books I've seen them, especially when I was in Greece. They were so heavy and so gigantic, 2 deacons would have to carry it. And
they do it with difficulty.
Exactly. I mean, they're really heavy, gold, silver objects and such, So, I mean, obviously there is, always some kind of minor exemptions when you're talking about, oil, wine to cleanse out the chalice, but, the exemptions you can talk about all the time. But the other point was, I think it's a common misconception that in the medieval period, everybody drank, of a necessity, only alcoholic beverages. And right. I was reading about this. If your well was in good condition and was generally covered up, people would actually drink water.
Yeah.
Right. A lot of people because that was cheap. And even when you drank wine, a lot of times you would water down the wine
so that you could drink. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. So you didn't get drunk when you're just you didn't want to. I mean, you had a higher tolerance because people did drink more. That is true.
Yeah, but if you mix your average table wine, and this is again, we're talking about a fairly fresh table wine. You're talking maybe 9 to 10% alcohol. You pour half and half with water. It's basically the strength of your average beer.
Yeah, it's kind of has a flavored water essentially.
Yeah, it's a little more like a weak wine, but yeah, well,
okay, yeah. I mean, depending on how much we use, yeah.
It depends on whether it's a sweet wine or not. I mean, if it's
my point is, people were drinking water as long as the source of water was safe.
Yeah, and that's what we should all do.
I mean, I could theoretically go half a mile down the road, or quarter mile down the road and drink out of the lake, but I'd probably get sick.
Yeah, I wouldn't trust that. That's still water. I wouldn't trust it. But yeah, but doesn't the Abbey use a well?
Yeah, we have a well. I mean, we need to eventually get one of those. I've been trying to find a way to get one of those hand pumps installed, because what happens if the power goes out, and that's happened before. But our well goes down like 1,000 feet. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah,
and I don't know if there are hand pumps powerful enough where you could get. I mean, I don't. Maybe there are.
They're definitely.
You probably have to hand pump it continuously for like an hour to get to create the pressure or something, the suction. I'm not quite sure.
There's some water come up, so usually it would take maybe about 10 minutes of pumping.
Atomic Lead says, I think the custom of watering down wine lasted into the 19th century. I think I think that's true too.
I think people still do it sometimes. There's nothing wrong with doing it. It's not a bad idea.
When I've been in Europe, and I've been at a dinner sometimes with like at a monastery or at a church gathering or whatever, they will serve wine with it'll be like a Saturday or after Sunday after liturgy, and they'll serve like a white wine or a red wine or whatever for dinner, which is to me is very unusual, I guess.
I'm not a big fan of that, even if it's a great feast. I mean,
even at somebody's house or whatever. My point is still that must be a thing that Anyway, I'm not criticizing, but I'm just saying is that to me, drinking wine is like a very unusual is not something I do all the time. You know what I mean? So
it is common in many cultures to have wine with dinner. I'm not attacking that per se. I'm not what ends up. I'm personally not a big fan of it.
Saint Nilus, Saint Nilus in Russia have the custom that the only time they ever used wine was for liturgical usages, as such. And people kind of get into the thing about that anyway. But not to go off too much on that subject. What can we summarize the episode? What can we say?
I think definitely the one thing we can summarize about the episode is that all of the things we've talked about, whether it be we're talking about beer and wine, whether we're talking about the substitution of meat or the difficulties related to that, these are all part of church history. When you're sitting here, it's a strange thought, but when you're sitting here saying, should I eat a veggie burger? Is it too much? It's a struggle that's been going on for 2,000 years. It's one that we've been doing since the fast has existed. And so it's nothing, in a sense, take comfort in the fact that your Orthodox ancestors probably went through the same thing. Maybe it wasn't a Boca burger, maybe it was a falafel shaped like a burger, but the point is, well, maybe not a burger, because burgers are technically 18th to 19th century inventions. But the point is, some kind of meat thing versus a meat substitute, or just having a salad. This is part of fasting. It's literally just how it's always been done. And almond milk is pretty ancient, so just enjoy it.
Okay.
So outside of that, I don't know if there are any other questions. We'll wait around for a minute or two, and then we'll close out for the day. Yeah, so that's what we're talking. We're talking food and drink and fasting and how things.
I wanted to mention the very odd post recently put on the Orthodox Apologetics War Zone.
Okay.
You know the odd post I'm talking about.
Which one? Is this the
one? The gentleman who was, I guess, a member of the Antiochians or the Ecumenical Patriarchate, and then he became a Roman Catholic like 6 years ago or 8 years ago.
I invited him to debate us on Twitter.
Oh. I mean, debate us on Twitter. You invited him on Twitter to come here and debate us
on the channel, but I've heard nothing yet from him.
Well, if you read the article, it was it was like the worst. Yeah, he's like, did he just write this in 5 minutes and just rattle off things? Because the third section, he was just talking about the Eastern world in general.
Yeah.
And so he threw out the Monophysites as Nestorians and blah blah. It'd be like me saying, well, you got all these Protestants, therefore I can't become Roman Catholic. I'm not going to consider it. I mean, I'm not going to consider it anyway. But okay, Father Joseph. It looks like we have a nickel. Go ahead.
Oh, well, I was going to say it's interesting that he replied. For somebody who was an Eastern Orthodox convert, I have to say this because if you read his earlier work, some of which I found on the War Zone, he was a former Protestant who was really struggling with the issue of the papacy in his mind, even when he became Orthodox. So he kind of just went whole hog for the papacy. It's interesting that he titled it on Twitter, "My Short Apologia Against Eastern Orthodoxy." But who is he really fighting? Is the question. I tend to read some of these things, and I read so much of their own personal thoughts and their own personal struggles and concepts and so on and so forth. And I wonder, when they write these things, are they really focused on defending the truth, or are they just focused on kind of justifying their own choices? And for me, when I think about defending orthodoxy, it's because I try to just read what the Holy Father say and follow it. And I think every Orthodox apologist should do that. But when it becomes about me, it's pointless. My conversion story is as one person said it, was a stroke, and then I didn't like Catholicism anymore. The point is that, it should not be that personal. I feel like a lot of the people that they seem torn between Roman Catholicism and Orthodoxy, half the time they're either Roman Catholic converts, or they really, really want that authoritarian rule of the papacy, even though it doesn't exist in the papacy. And that's, to me, that's more psychological than anything else if you're kind of searching for some sort of absolute power to tell you what to do. I think it's also why so many people get into the whole elderism thing, because they need someone to tell them what to do. But that's not how Orthodoxy works. We have Christ to tell us what to do, and the Holy Fathers to teach us how to do it. There's only so much hand holding that you can have.
Okay. Well, maybe we should have an episode about this.
Yeah, I can't see why not. You just devoted to this guy.
Well, in general, kind of very, I don't know, the bad apologetics of Roman Catholicism, I suppose, or
Well,
not quite sure.
Well, Atomic Lead writes, quote, "It's a sin against charity not to submit to the Pope I ignore in order to be tread." I don't know what this guy is. He sounds like your typical. What do you call it? Vatican II RC. So
I mean, he was big. When he was with the Antiochians or the OCA or the Ecumenical Patriarchate, he was a big into the ecumenical stuff anyway. And people who are like that, they don't really have a clear understanding of Orthodoxy to begin with.
When you come to Orthodoxy, you're coming because it's the true faith. And if it's any other reason than that Orthodoxy is the true faith, it shouldn't be done. It's the wrong reason. It's one. We believe in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, and if you're not joining it, then what's the reason you're coming to begin with? And that's the thing that I hate to say it, but a lot of people they have to confront that, and it's easy when you are kind of like a nominal Roman Catholic and you go visit a big Russian church and you see all these bells and stuff, and it's very the smells and bells, so on and so forth. But for coming to say a really simple Western rite service, you might not get that infatuation, but the whole point is the focus has to be on the truth of the faith, not just on how things look.
Okay, well, looks like we have no extra questions, so we should close everything down.
All right. All right. Well, thank you everyone for listening, and have a good night to all of you. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your comments. Hopefully, we're helpful in some way. And again, like and subscribe if you haven't already. And have a great night. Father Enoch, benedicite.
Benedicite.